Hey, how's it going, everybody? If you're new here, welcome in. And if you've been here before, you know what to do. Smash the like button on the way in. I'm Rollshambo, the connoisseur and collector of all things sharp and shiny. And today I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about some tips that I wish I had known, that I've collected over the last couple of years of getting into knife collecting. You see, I have been a fan of knives ever since I was about 6 or 7 years old, but it wasn't until the last 2 or 3 years that I really started getting into the hobby as an enthusiast and a collector. And in that time with this channel, I've had the experience of handling hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of knives and reviewing them and carrying them every day and looking up spec sheets and researching and all of that jazz. And in that time, I have come to learn a few things that if I had known back then, I could have saved myself potentially thousands of dollars and hours of heartache. So I figured, let's go ahead and share this with the community in case there's any new people out there. Shout out to the new people. Let me know in the comment section if that's you, if you just recently got into collecting knives or you recently got into the EDC hobby. And while you're down there, let us know what sparked the flame for you. Now, I've got 5 tips and we're going to start from the bottom up with number 5. Stop justifying your love for the hobby. And this is a big one, guys, because when I first started getting into knife collecting, the immediate question that I always got asked by people who found out that I was starting to buy all these knives was, do you really need another knife? And often that's asked by our significant others when they see these things start to pile up. And the answer is no. If you're in this hobby and you have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 200 knives, you don't need all of those knives. There is absolutely no reason why anyone would need those. We're not in an apocalyptic situation. We don't need them, guys. We just don't. There are people out there who buy knives because they need them, but they don't own 100+ knives. They own maybe 1, maybe 2, maybe a handful of cheap $20, $30, $40 knives, because that's all you really need to spend on a knife to get work done. That's it. 30 to 50 bucks. That's it. Those are not the people going out there and, you know, buying knife cases and filling them up with expensive premium designer knives or knives like this Hinderer XM18. They're just not doing it because they don't need to. It should never be a matter of need. If you're in this hobby, you need to understand that chances are you're in this hobby because it brings you joy. So next time someone asks me why you really need that next knife or why you need to spend X amount of dollars on whatever, just remember, you're doing it because it brings you joy, and that should always be good enough. Number 4, don't buy clones. I know I'm going to get some heat for this in the comments section because there is actually a group of people out there that love collecting clone knives, and they are usually the kinds of people that are really butthurt about how much really premium designer knives cost. Let's be real. A Koenig Arius could cost anywhere in the realm of $650 to, $1,200. And so, of course, people are going to go out there and be like, well, I could get this cheaper. And I swear it's just as good, if not better, than the $800, $1,200 knife. And they're welcome to that opinion. But for the most part, when people buy clones, it's either because they don't know any better. They think they just found a good deal online, they got scammed, or they're just butthurt about how much the original costs, and they believe that they could, in fact, get that same level of joy out of buying that $50 to $60 to $70 clone than they would have had they shelled out all the money for the real deal. Now, clones are bad for the market for a number of different reasons, not the least of which being that it's the theft of intellectual property. Somebody took the time to design that knife. And in many cases, they took the time to make that knife. And the knife costs what it costs, because, not just because of what materials are, but because of the manufacturing process, the cost of learning the skills, the cost of the machinery, the cost of the overhead, so on and so forth. And for a cheap overseas, usually Chinese company to come by to yank that design and to make it at a much cheaper rate, usually the sacrifice is in quality somewhere. Usually we get lesser materials. Usually it's not built to the same standards. Usually it's going to fool a certain amount of people. And so it can also be harmful, because when those of ill repute get their hands on those clones and they decide, hey, I want the real deal, and they go to sell it, oftentimes they can list it as the real thing, and an unsuspecting newbie might go ahead and buy it thinking that, you know, hey, I just saved up so much money, I can finally afford one. This one's, you know, it's a little bit cheaper than brand new, I can do it. And then they get scammed buying a fake. And it's not usually until the other party has gotten away with it that they find out. I have actually accidentally bought a clone. I thought I was getting a real microtech auto stitch, but I wasn't. And the guy claimed that it was authentic, and I didn't do my due diligence well enough. And that happened a couple of years ago. And it still stings to this day when I think of it, because I got screwed and I never was made completely whole from that transaction. But it was a lesson. It was just a very expensive lesson. So buying clones is not only immoral, it's also irresponsible, and it doesn't support the community as a whole. And it continues to support these companies that steal intellectual property. If you made something, if you took the time to design and create something, and someone came along and ripped it off and tried to pass it off as the same thing, but for a quarter of the price, I imagine that you'd be pretty upset about it too. It's just something that we can do as part of the community. Don't buy clones, guys. Number 3, make your own checklist. Look, it's easy to find a channel that you enjoy watching, and in that course, decide that their opinions need to be your opinions because you resonate with that person, and that can lead to spending lots of money on knives that just end up sitting in the drawer, never getting used or enjoyed, that you can't bring yourself to sell because it's so-and-so's channel's favorite sub whatever dollar knife, and owning it for some reason makes you feel closer to them in some way. It's okay if you disagree with your favorite knife channel, by the way. Figure out what brings you the most joy in the items that you spend so much money on, or whether or not anyone else likes or dislikes something has absolutely no bearing on how well you will ultimately feel about it once you have it in hand. It's crazy to me. I'll post a video review of a knife and somebody will come in and say, well, I heard this on such and such channel. I don't like it. It's going to be a no for me. Why is that? How can you make a judgment call about a knife having never handled it? Is this based on your checklist, or is this based on their checklist? Are you going to turn around and buy the next knife that they highly recommend just because they said so? And if so, how happy is that really going to make you? Inevitably, everyone learns this the hard way, but we all have different preferences. The beauty of this hobby is that there are so many options out there that we're never going to agree on everything. It's impossible. There are people out there that absolutely hate the Koenig Arias, that hate the Oz Machine Company Roosevelt, that hate such and such knife. Those knives are legendary. Most people agree on them, but there are definitely people that disagree. My point is it's important to make your own checklist. Are things like T8 hardware important? Are things like blade to handle scale ratio important to you? I actually used to care about blade to handle scale ratio, believe it or not. This Ferro Monster Aurora Rays is a good example of a knife that I love that does not have great blade to handle scale ratio. That ratio makes absolutely no difference to me in this knife whatsoever. And in fact, I didn't even realize that it had bad blade to handle scale ratio until, a little bit down the road after carrying it, because I was having so much fun enjoying it. But there are many people out there that'll look at that and say, I can't do it. Over $200, the blade doesn't reach the end of the handle scales when closed. That's a no-go for me. But do they truly understand why? Why? Does it make absolutely any difference at all? No. And yet, there are people that are so OCD about it that it does matter to them. Channels often find the little things to harp on when they look at a knife, because knives have gotten so good these days. But the fact of the matter is that, especially on this knife, it makes absolutely no difference to its quality or its design as to whether or not that blade reaches the end of those handle scales. So it's not something that I care about. It might be something that you care about, and you might have many different reasons for that. But that's my point. My checklist does not need to be your checklist, and neither does anybody else's. There's a lot of options out there. Make your own checklist and decide what's most important to you in the items that you're deciding to buy. Number 2, and guys, this is a good one. It's also one that I know people are going to have an issue with. Country of origin does not determine quality at all. I totally get it. There was a time and place when made in China meant cheap and made in US meant robust and reliable and longevity and America. I love American made knives, by the way. My point is, knives made in China have gotten really good. Like, I'm talking really good. And not only that, but we can get an amazing Chinese made knife that in every category possible, it's better than knives made here in the US en masse, and usually also less expensive. I shouldn't have to spend 20 minutes giving you a dissertation on why knives can be made better in China. But the issue that I have is that there are so many people out there that are like, no, knives made in China are bad. Knives made in China, blah, blah, blah. And then the other side of that fence is also ridiculous because they're saying, well, you know, knives made here in the United States are too expensive. Why do they cost that much? Blah, blah, blah. It comes down to the cost of manufacturing. The cost of manufacturing in China is so much cheaper than it is here in the United States because they don't have to pay their workers the same amount that we have to pay our workers. They don't have to spend as much on their manufacturing equipment as we have to spend on ours. Their supply chains are so much more efficient than ours, and they have such better manufacturing processes in place because we have safety standards, because we have to carry insurance for our employees, so on and so forth. Anything made in the United States is going to cost more. Now, I will say this. The Chinese knife manufacturers have a lot of American knife makers to thank for where they currently are because they have learned a lot from us. That doesn't mean that an American-made knife is too much money or that a Chinese-made knife isn't as quality. It just means that they are different markets and you can expect different price tags depending upon where the knife was made and how it was made. For example, I myself am becoming a bit of an American knife collector, because I absolutely love the legacy of American knife making. And I think that there is something really cool about knives made here in the United States. But at the same time, I can fully appreciate a beautifully made knife from China. For example, this is the Reccomended WK1, and it is absolutely gorgeous. And if this knife was made here in the United States, it would probably cost over $1,000 based on the level of machining and materials and the level of quality. As it stands, it's still not a cheap knife. You can get this specific one for around $350 online. But if it was made in a different country, if it was made here in the United States, we would spend anywhere in the realm of $800 to $1,000 on this knife all day. And finally, we are down to my number 1 tip for people that are new to the knife and EDC community. And that tip is simply save your money. It's important to look at this like a hunt. When you start getting into knife collecting, it's very common for people to look at those super expensive knives, you know, the Koenig Ariuses and the Oz Machine Company Roosevelts and the Craig Brown FSDs of the world and say, oh, man, I would love to have that. It's just too expensive. And then while drooling over knives like that, they continue to go and buy 10, 20, 30 budget knives, all while still saying, I can't afford it. So I'm going to go find something that I've convinced myself will bring me the same amount of joy for a tenth of the price. The truth is that they can, in fact, afford it. They're just impatient. Instead of buying the next 10 $70 knives, they could have actually saved that money, waited and hunted and purchased what they actually wanted. Look, I have spent so much money on my hunt for the knives that are on my grail list. I've spent a lot of money on knives along the way, and I don't necessarily regret it. I've learned a lot of things about knives in that time, and I've had a lot of joy from those. And yet, here I am, 3 years into being a knife collector, and when I look at the amount of money that I've spent on knives, I realize that there are many knives that I told myself I could not afford, and instead of saving, I spent a lot of money on other knives that were just a distraction that I ended up turning around and selling or losing or or whatever. And if I had just been a little bit more disciplined about it, if I had just admitted to myself, look, true happiness is at the end of this rainbow, and these are the steps that it takes to get there, i.e. saving your money, then I could have actually had those knives. But people like myself are impatient. And so along the way, we get distracted and we never end up getting those other knives. Or by the time we do, we've actually spent way more money than we would have had we just saved up from the start and joined the hunt. The hunt is one of those things that makes knife collecting and grail hunting so much fun. There's nothing quite like saving up some money and then waiting for a release, sniping the knife swap threads on Reddit, looking at blade for sale forums. Once you finally get that knife that you've been hunting for, it will be very, very satisfying, trust me. Now, I know there's a lot of people out there that actually do collect budget knives, or that's their thing. They just want to have a bunch of budget knives because it gives them a knife that they can beat on and feel good about. And then when they lose it or break it, it's not a big deal. They can easily replace it. That's a different story. But this piece of advice is specifically for those who buy cheaper knives as a way to distract themselves from what they actually want. But you'll have to let me know, has any of this been helpful in the slightest? If you thought that this was helpful or enlightening in any way and you haven't done so yet, please consider tapping that subscribe button. And by the way, guys, if you want to watch more awesome knife and EDC content, go ahead and click on one of the videos that pops up next.